Well, with Labor Day now in the rearview mirror and a cold chill in the air, that can only mean one thing. The NFL regular season has arrived. I'm Rob Wong, joined alongside by Post Media NFL columnist John Kryk. Just head over to our newsletter section, and you can sign up for John's Kryk Slants newsletter, where you can get all his exclusive weekly NFL picks. John, it is finally here, week number 1. And before we take a deeper dive into some of the marquee games and some of your picks this week, got to ask you about the Buffalo Bills, who come into the season as Super Bowl favorites. It's crazy to even say that about a Bills team that hasn't been there for quite some time. But putting aside week 1, how do you think they'll fare this upcoming season?
Well, I mean, like you said, for 20 years, I know Bills fans, of course, who were just would get offended if they weren't even mentioned as one of the, also-rans. So this team that was in the NFL playoff wilderness for 17 straight years, suddenly now under the GM Brandon Beane and head coach Sean McDermott regime are seen to be as stable and as strong a franchise and this year as a team as any in the league. I mean, you never know going into the offseason and through training camp and, with the magazines coming out, what a team is thought to be and what their potential is. But now that everybody's making all their season predictions, I think it was NFL Network, every one of their polled experts predicted the Bills would win the Super Bowl against whatever NFC team is. It varied, right? So that's the kind of pressure. All of a sudden, it's just there that the Bills not only have a chance, they're seen as the best team in the league that will end up on February 12th in Glendale, Arizona, of winning the Super Bowl.
Yeah, Bills fans definitely feeling good about it, but feeling a little bit terrified as well with all the expectations on their favorite team. All right, let's get into some of these games, and there are 3 that jump off the page this week that feature quarterbacks taking on their old teams, the old revenge narrative, John. And we'll start with the Browns and Panthers squaring off. Baker Mayfield is now the starting quarterback for Carolina after getting jettisoned from Cleveland. What are you expecting from Baker Mayfield and the Panthers this year, going up against a Browns team that obviously had a lot of controversy with their acquisition of Deshaun Watson this offseason?
Well, there's a Browns player this week that said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, but when he was asked that question, he said, "Well, what are you going to get from Baker Mayfield?" He was like, "Who knows?" That's kind of that was kind of the Baker Mayfield we thought or saw for those 4 years in Cleveland. And part of it, like this past year, I always thought that, he was banged up and hurt. And that will always be not just for quarterbacks, but for any player in the league. It's just, is it better to play as there's an old adage among NFL coaches, the most important ability is availability. And he put himself out there, hurt, clearly wasn't the quarterback he was the year before when he led the team to one playoff win, a blowout win at Pittsburgh, and by rights probably should have won that game against Kansas City the week later and would have put them in the AFC Championship game. So what are we going to see from him now in Carolina? They only traded for him at the end of July. So he literally, here's your playbook. It's time for a training camp to open. And any quarterback or player will tell you that, when you have a new playbook, you want it at the beginning of April when teams and players are allowed to reconvene after the offseason. He didn't have any of that. It was Sam Darnold and the other backups. And so Baker Mayfield, though, within a couple, 3 weeks, was clearly the better quarterback, and he's going to play against his old team, the Browns. And he's been a real good boy for what he's been saying since he was traded to Carolina. His first news conference, it was like listening to Peyton Manning or Tom Brady saying all the right things, nothing inflammatory about his old team. "Oh, no, I enjoyed my time in Cleveland. It was helpful for me," blah, blah, blah. So he's now, saying the right things. And now is he going to be doing the right things in the leadership department in the locker room? Because that was one of the big knocks against him in Cleveland. So I expect he's going against, remember, he's not going against Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson is suspended until December. And it's Jacoby Brissett. So is he better than Jacoby Brissett? Sure. And it's a home game for Carolina. They'll all be pumped up. Their defense likes to get after the quarterback. They'll get into Brissett's face, and I think we'll see a good game from Baker Mayfield.
Yeah, it seems like it's setting up well for him in this week 1 matchup. Let's shift over to the New York Jets, who will not have Zach Wilson as their starting quarterback for several weeks with that leg injury, of course. So it's 37-year-old Joe Flacco stepping in to take on his old friends at Baltimore as the Ravens head to New York to square off against the Jets. Joe Flacco, been around for a long time. I think we kind of know what to expect at this stage of his career. The Jets currently 7.5-point home underdogs. Do they have any chance at covering in this game against the Ravens and Lamar Jackson?
Covering? Sure. I've been an admirer of Joe Flacco since that 10 years ago this season, since he led the Ravens to the Super Bowl with, statistically and by every other barometer you might want to use, one of the best playoff runs by any quarterback ever. I mean, he was fabulous. Yes, that was 10 years ago. We get that. But, you know, he, as a backup who's kind of bounced around between Denver, the Jets in the last few seasons, he still has the arm. He'll always have the gun. And I think he's got a little bit more moxie and a little bit more on the ball, if you will, than most people will give him credit for. He's played on some pretty lousy teams in the last few seasons, not unlike Matt Ryan, who's now with the Indianapolis Colts, with all those terrible Falcons teams that didn't have a running game whatsoever or had a horrible offensive line. You got a good pass that goes back there. They're trailing in games almost all the time. He's taking chances with his throws, and everybody says, oh, just an interception and sack machine. Well, that's because the other team knows that he has to pass because they're trailing. And I'm kind of thinking that that's kind of been the way Joe Flacco's last few years have been as a backup. I wouldn't be surprised if he does pretty well.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to watch that game for sure. Finally, on Monday night, Russell Wilson and the Broncos heading to Seattle to face off against the Seahawks on Monday night in the late game, of course. This one has fireworks written all over it. It's going to be an emotional night for Russell, I imagine, but this is a guy that seemingly can step up in the spotlight whenever that moment comes.
Yeah, it was thinking it'd be strange to see Russell Wilson and the Seahawks and Pete Carroll, their head coach, on opposite sidelines. But, hey, he's got a built-in excuse. If he throws 5 interceptions, so he's going to go, well, what do you expect? For the past 10 seasons, I've been throwing to Seattle Seahawks. And so, you know, it was hard to break that trend in my first game with my new team. He just signed a monster new contract. Russell Wilson still is good. He seemed to, in the last year or two, and I'm granted he was injured for a big chunk of last season, but I kind of thought that he was getting just a little bit impatient in the pocket as far as just not waiting for his blocks always to set up. He would seem to bust out of the pocket early sometimes just because, much like Matt Ryan in Atlanta, he just wasn't trusting his offensive line anymore. And we just didn't see, I thought, consistent elite play from him. He just looked a little skittish in the pocket. And so now that he's on a better team, more talent at least, and definitely a better offensive line. I'm really anxious to see after the first few games this year whether Russell Wilson is he's got over that. He's now the Russell Wilson that we remember him to be, who can take those moonshot deep passes to his, and he's got a good wide receiver core there to hit his guys all over the field. And then take off and run it sometimes, but not in sort of like the harried fashion, which I kind of thought he had kind of slid into that bad groove the last couple of seasons.
All right, can't talk the NFL without talking about Tom Brady, who his Tampa Bay Buccaneers head off to Dallas to take on the Cowboys on Sunday night. Brady, of course, was MIA throughout training camp and preseason for who knows what. Numerous speculations about what was going on behind the scenes for Tom Brady. But when he's on the field, we know what he can do. What are you expecting from Brady this season and the Buccaneers?
It's crazy that, you know, at age 44 last year, if Aaron Rodgers had retired a year earlier, Tom Brady was the MVP of the league by almost everybody's measure or light. I expect that we'll see the Tom Brady. I mean, I don't think he's just going to hit the wall suddenly in any season that he continues to play. I think he's too smart to let himself, if he knows that he's hit that wall, I think that's when he wouldn't have come back otherwise. So I don't think we'll ever see that out of Tom Brady. If he's coming back, he's made the decision that I can still play at an elite level. I don't think he'll let himself just kind of be second tier. That's just a hunch. But they're going against the Dallas team, which, you know, everybody knows, especially if you're a long-suffering now Cowboys fan, that this team just underachieves in the playoffs as poorly as any team of the last 20, 30 years, right? Since they last won that Super Bowl in 1995, they have not even reached an NFC championship game or even really come close very much. So I look at them, and there's maybe 2 or 3 teams in the league that definitively did not get better this past offseason, and they're one of them. Amari Cooper now is their good wide receivers now with the Cleveland Browns. They lost Randy Gregory to Denver, their best pass rusher. And so that you look at their incoming talent versus what left, and nobody could rightfully say that their roster is better. However, they started to win some games last year by virtue of their defense, which the year before was just the NFL's worst probably in 2020. But Dan Quinn, the former Atlanta coach, came in there, and they started to play very good defense in many games. I think that's the most intriguing angle to this Week 1 matchup against Tampa Bay on Sunday night. And that is, what is Dan Quinn, with all the offseason to prepare, going to do against this Tampa Bay offense, which probably is going to be very similar to what we'd seen the last 2 years with Brady. That, to me, is the exciting angle there, because the Dallas offense probably isn't nearly as good.
Well, it should be interesting to see what happens there as well. It's going to be a ton of fun with Week 1 now upon us. That will do it for this week. As always, you can find John's work at Post Media and on Twitter at John Kryk.